Hello everyone. Sorry, just pressing the record button. Always forget to do that otherwise, which is a bit irritating. Welcome, well, Happy New Year for 1st of January 2021. See what this year, see what this year has in store for us. Should be interesting, won't it? So this week, there's not that many questions, which is quite good because one of them I think would really benefit from a bit of a deep dive. So I'm going to read out two questions and then I'm going to go into quite a lot of detail dealing with them both. And then there's a few kind of shorter questions at the end of it. So one of the questions is, William, just still on cravings. I get to the fantasy stage, but I still get caught. What can I do to manage others? Okay. The other one I think is very interesting. It's 2020 has completely changed the way I drink. I've been spending 6 to 8 weeks abstaining and then getting so fed up I've been drinking to try and get obliterated on my own. This isn't party binge drinking, it's pouring alcohol on being extremely stressed and down to achieve numbness. Each binge has gone on for about a week until I got very sick of it and sick in general, and then had to go through a very nasty withdrawal, then back to a month or two of abstaining. There have been about 8 of these binges through the year, and each one has got more dangerous. I don't drink 90% of the time, and I don't want to. I realise I can't continue to do this for very serious physical and mental health issues. So I listened to Alcohol Explained yesterday, but do you have any tips? So I think it's really useful to kind of do a back to basics deep dive on this. To do this, we'll start, and I talk about this a lot, but I think it's useful to keep going on about it with the physiological side of it. So alcohol is a sedative, it's a chemical depressant, which means it decreases or inhibits nerve activity. Okay, so that's why when you drink, you will feel slightly relaxed, slightly numbed after having a drink. But the problem is the brain reacts to that. And what the brain does is it becomes hypersensitive, so it can still work through the sedating effects of the alcohol. Okay, and then when the alcohol wears off, there's a period of time where the brain is still in that oversensitization phase before it then goes back to normal. Okay, and that oversensitization phase is essentially alcohol withdrawal. You feel slightly on edge, slightly out of sorts, and slightly anxious. Okay, so the points to note from it are the brain's reacting to the amount of alcohol that is in there. So if you have one small glass of wine, the brain does react to that by becoming overly sensitive, but just slightly overly sensitive because there's less alcohol in one small glass of wine. Whereas if you're drinking 2 bottles of spirits, it's got to become hugely oversensitive. And so as you can see, when the alcohol wears off, the withdrawal is worse the more you've been drinking. Okay, there's a few points to note from this. One of which is the brain becomes increasingly proficient at countering the alcohol, which is why the more you drink over the years, the more you're able to drink. That's what tolerance is. Tolerance is essentially your brain being able to counteract more and more alcohol. But the knock-on effect of that is that the withdrawal gets worse. The other point to bear in mind here, which is something people struggle to get their heads around, everyone has alcohol withdrawal. Okay, if you've never drunk alcohol in your life and you have one small glass of wine, you have alcohol withdrawal from it because your brain reacts to it, the alcohol wears off, and there's a feeling of anxiety that kicks in afterwards. But the point is, it will be extremely minor compared to if you've built up to 2 or 3 bottles of spirits. And then when they wear off, that's when you get the full DTs, the shakes, the nausea, the inability to sleep or eat. That's all that is. That's also why drinkers wake up at 4 a.m. unable to sleep, because the alcohol wears off and they enter the oversensitization phase. It's very similar to if you drink too much coffee. Your heart rate goes up, you're unable to sleep, you're really anxious about things. And that's the alcohol withdrawal. Okay, so everyone suffers alcohol withdrawal, and for regular drinkers, the main pleasure in drinking, the reason they really desire those evening drinks or afternoon drinks or whatever they are, is because they're anaesthetizing the anxiety that's been caused by the previous drinks. Okay, so that then begs the question, well, why can some people take it or leave it, and other people just can't leave it alone? Other people don't have an off switch. Okay, so this brings us on to a slightly different stage of things. And that's how addiction is essentially a learned behavior. So everyone has alcohol withdrawal, but a lot of people, it would never dawn on them to have another drink to get rid of that alcohol withdrawal. But the trouble is, as the years go by and you drink more and more, your brain starts to learn that another alcoholic drink will relieve the withdrawal caused by the previous drinks. Okay, this is learned behavior. And what's learned cannot be unlearned. So when you reach the stage of having to have a drink to get rid of the ill effects of the last drink, you can never unlearn that. That's just something you live with then. And that's why people say, I haven't got an off switch. All that means is they have learned on a subconscious level that when one alcoholic drink wears off, they want another drink to get rid of it. Okay, so we've got all that in place. There's another big aspect to this, and this is to do with the first point here, which is cravings. So cravings are a conscious thought process whereby you start fantasizing about how nice it would be to have a drink. Okay, people think that cravings are just something that happens to them and they can't do anything about it. It's an actual thought process. It starts when the thought of an alcoholic drink enters your mind, but it's what you do with that thought that decides whether it turns into a craving or not. So if the thought of an alcoholic drink enters your mind and you start sitting there thinking, oh, that would be really nice to have that glass of wine or that cold beer, and wouldn't it be wonderful, and wouldn't it taste good, and wouldn't all my problems suddenly miraculously disappear just because I have this chemical in my bloodstream, then what you're doing, you're no longer, so say you sit down at the end of the day in front of the TV or with a nice meal or with your partner or with friends or whatever it is to relax. If you're then suddenly thinking, oh, I want a drink and I can't have one, suddenly you're not relaxing in front of the TV, you're not relaxing with your partner, you're not enjoying the company of your friends, your mind is not concentrating on something that should be pleasurable. What you're doing is you're torturing yourself with the thought of something you can't have. It's as if you're dieting and really hungry and you suddenly start fantasizing about your favorite food. It's not particularly pleasant. So if you start that fantasizing phase, that's when it really starts to get to you because you can't have one. Okay, when you get that in mind, you start to see a lot more of how these different drinkers can fit in, because don't forget, if you're drinking heavily at night, the alcohol withdrawal's kicking in about 5 hours after your last drink. But then a lot of people don't have a drink at 4 a.m, and they don't have a drink at 6 a.m, or 9 a.m, or 10 a.m. A lot of people go all the way through to the evening. So the question is then, well, if they're suffering a withdrawal, how come they go through it all, but it's the evening when it becomes unbearable? Well, that's where the cravings come in, because craving, don't forget, is when you're torturing yourself with the thought of something. So for the regular drinker, they're sat there in the evening, and yes, there's a big element of anxiety that's there caused by the previous drinks that a drink will get rid of, and they start to fantasize about it and torture themselves over it. But a key point here is a lot of people don't drink in the morning, and they don't drink at lunchtime, and they don't drink until they get home from work or turn their laptop off if you're, working from home, whatever it might be. So that's where the cravings come in. They don't wake up and start craving simply because they know in their heart of hearts that they don't drink in the morning. So they don't wake up and start fantasizing. It's only when the prospect of having a drink becomes a reality that the craving really starts to kick in. Because don't forget what craving is. You're sat there thinking, oh, wouldn't it be nice if I had a drink now? If you know you're not going to have a drink, you don't waste time fantasizing about it. So people will wake up in the morning and they don't crave because they're not going to have a drink then. And they get through their whole day not drinking. But it's when they sit down at the end of the day and entertain the possibility of having one that it starts to become a problem. So it starts to fall into place, and it's quite easy to then explain to regular drinkers, well, your evening drinks, all you're really doing is causing yourself intense tiredness and anxiety. Because don't forget as well, there's another point to make here on sleep, because sleep isn't just about falling unconscious for a few hours. It's about going through actual sleep cycles. Some of those sleep cycles are when you're very deeply asleep, deeply unconscious, but there's other crucial sleep cycles like REM sleep, where your brain lights up almost as if you're fully conscious. So that's what you need to bear in mind with sleep. You're going through different levels of consciousness. You're going really deeply unconscious and then right up through to being almost conscious and then back down again. The problem is when you're drinking, because you're sedated for the first part of the night, you can't get into those higher levels of sleep like REM sleep. And for the latter half of the night, because you're overly stimulated, you can't sleep at all. So you end up not getting the sleep you need. So people who are drinking regularly, the main benefit of their drinking is they're anesthetizing the anxiety and tiredness that's been caused by the previous drink. So their lives are lives of tiredness and anxiety caused by previous drinking, to differing degrees, because if they're only having one or two drinks, that anxiety, it will be there, but it will be fairly minor. But when you're drinking more and more, that anxiety builds up more and more and more. And as I say, the pleasure they get from drinking is anesthetizing for a few minutes, a few hours every evening or day or whatever, the anxiety and tiredness caused by the previous drinks. That's fairly straightforward. But what becomes a bit more complicated is like the chap here who's going 6 or 8 weeks without drinking and then just drinking himself into oblivion for a week at a time, which is interesting because actually that's the cycle I was in. I was never a daily drinker, or I was for some parts of my life, but the vast majority of it, particularly to the end, I didn't drink for a few days and then I drink almost constantly for a few hours, days at a time. So that's an even more interesting one. So to explain that, you need to get into your mindset, the craving process, and the physical side of it. Because after a few weeks, so if you're not drinking regularly, you're through the withdrawal and back to normal within 5 or 6 days. And so what's happening here is this chap stopping drinking, getting back to normal, but over time the cravings are starting to kick in, eventually giving into it. And then obviously as soon as one drink wears off, you want another one, another one, another one, and it just starts a period of just constant drinking. Now the problem is as well, when the boundaries aren't there, and don't forget withdrawals are kind of to do with boundaries. Sorry, not withdrawals, cravings are kind of to do with boundaries. So if you are someone who, only drinks when the evening comes, as I say, you don't crave during the day, probably because you're not sat there fantasizing about having a drink. But the problem is when those boundaries disappear, when you get used to morning and nighttime drinking and just drinking as soon as you get up, that's when almost the second you come to, you're in alcohol withdrawal and you start entertaining the thought of having a drink and you start craving one. The problem is when you do this and you're drinking constantly, your body literally can't deal with it. You're drinking so much alcohol, you just start to become extremely sick and then you have to stop. And that's the cycle that you're going through. So the problem is for you here, it's not the daily drinking, but it's stopping the start of that cycle. And I think what you need to bear in mind here are a couple of elements, one of which is fading effect bias. So fading effect bias, and you mentioned that you listened to Alcohol Explained too. Fading effect bias I deal with more in, I think, the first book. But fading effect bias is a way by which humans look back on past events more positively than when they happen. Literally, your memory of them starts to change. You start to see things more positively. And what I do deal in the second book is ambition. And by ambition, I mean, I'm not talking about it purely in the sense of trying to get the next step on whatever career ladder you're on, but more to do with how all living things want to improve their lot in life. Now, that desire to improve your life is made up of two innate and very basic driving forces. One is to be very critical of what we have, and the other is to idolize or fantasize about what we don't have. So if you don't have something, you make it out to be far better than it actually is. And if you do have something, you tend to be very critical of it. And we see this kind of thing with jobs a lot, where you think, oh, I just want to get this job, everything will be perfect if I get it, and then you get it, and within a few months, years, whatever, you're sick to the back teeth of it and looking for the next job. You see it a lot with relationships, where you desperately want someone when they're not available, and when they are available, you're less interested in them. You might be with someone and you're very dismissive of them, but when it looks like you're going to lose them, you suddenly really appreciate them and you don't want to lose them. And it's that constant tension. And all that is fantasizing and really wanting what you can't have when it's not accessible, and really taking for granted and being critical of something that you do have. It's a great driving force because it makes people want to constantly be bettering themselves, which is a good thing. But when it comes to addiction, it can be hugely problematic, because it means that you look back on your drinking or whatever drug it is, but we're talking about alcohol here. So your drinking days, and you start to think of it being much better than it was. And you start to, when you quit drinking, suddenly you forget about the misery that it is, and you start thinking that it was far more better than it actually was, because you then don't have drinking. It's not a thing you possess anymore. You've stopped it. So you start to idolize it and fantasize about it. So I think it's a very difficult cycle to get out of, because with the regular drinker, you can quite easily explain to them how, if you stop for just a few days, your sleep starts to improve, the anxiety disappears, your brain chemistry gets back to normal. And there's these massive benefits as long as you can go long enough till you get there. With this kind of, and this is a particularly extreme sort of binge drinking. I'm not just talking about getting drunk a couple of nights of the week. This is someone who's going a couple of months without drinking, and then doing almost a week of constant extreme drinking. Obviously, the place to stop it is before you start each binge. And when you're doing that, what you need to do, you need to start, I mean, hopefully you won't go through another of these binges, because they're extremely debilitating. They do take a huge hit on your, forget mental health, but your physical health. But you need to be analysing what's driving you into it. So is it stress? Is it loneliness? What is it? What's driving you to do it? And when you start doing it, you will have an idea that drink will help, that it will make you feel better. But when you actually start drinking, you'll realise it doesn't. And that's what you need to do. And that's what most people need to do to get to grips with their drinking, is to start recognizing, seeing what the triggers are and recognizing how they are false, because that's true of everyone. We want a drink because we perceive a benefit with it, but actually those benefits are false. It doesn't particularly help in these situations. In fact, it usually makes things worse. So that's something you need to really work on, is to see it for what it is. We tend to build drinking up into much more. We kind of think it's going to relieve all our problems and make us happy. And, you may be stressed or lonely and you think, yes, I can just sit there happy and drinking. But of course, drinking isn't happiness at all. Even when people are drinking, they're pretty miserable. And in fact, it increases misery when you're actually drinking. There's an impact it has on emotions, because there's a part of the brain called the limbic system. One of its jobs is to regulate emotion, so to actually dampen down emotions when they kick in. It's particularly vulnerable to the intoxicating effects of alcohol. So the more you drink, the harder it is for your brain to regulate emotions. And that's why drinkers tend to be very emotional, be it anger or tears or regret or whatever. The typical view of the drinker is someone who's very violent or crying into their drinks, or, ringing up your ex at 4 a.m. because you suddenly really want to talk to them and miss them. And all it is the fact that your brain can no longer regulate emotion. So people generally find when they are drinking, they're actually, so they're more miserable than when they'd started. So if something happens to make you angry or upset, the first drink will anesthetize that to a degree, but then the alcohol wears off and you need another drink to replace that. And as you drink more and more, you start to anesthetize very heavily the limbic system. So your emotions start to run unchecked. So that anger or upset that you started with just then flies off the rails anyway. So you need to start getting to grips with the reality of drinking. Stop building it up into something that it isn't and fantasizing it and thinking that you drink and you're sat there really happy. You won't do. Start seeing it for what it is. It's a drug, a particularly damaging drug. It kills living things. We use it as a sanitizer because it kills things. It kills living cells. And that's why it causes things like throat cancer and stomach cancer. The parts of your body that regularly come into contact with it start to become cancerous and die. And it's something that makes you feel slightly dulled before then causing a corresponding feeling of anxiety that needs another drink to take the edge off it. So that's the one prong you want to start working at, is to start seeing it for what it is and how it's not helping you. It's not doing what you want it to do, because if you're thinking it's relieving stress and making you feel better, it isn't. And the other point with this is try and have some other coping mechanisms, because also I do talk about this a lot, but when you drink, because it's a sedative, we tend to take the edge off things. So you might find it stress building up over a few weeks and you suddenly can't take it anymore and you start drinking. So absent the drink, what other ways can you deal with stress? So I use exercise a lot. I find it's an excellent way of not just stress relief, but just coping with life generally. So that's something you could do. There's things like meditation and yoga, neither of which I've ever done, but I always recommend, but purely because so many other people seem to do them and find benefits from them. Then you've got things like just reading books. I'm not talking about quit lit, where you can read quit lit, but novels. Just lose yourself in a good book or a film or whatever it is, but get those coping mechanisms in place. So think to yourself, if you just come out of a binge, I'm not going to drink. That's fine. You're not going to drink. That's a given. But what are you going to do in 6 to 8 weeks when things start to get on top of you again? Are you going to go for a long run? Are you going to go for a walk? Are you going to read a book? Are you going to put the TV on? Are you going to cook yourself a night? Think about these ways. Think about your worst possible day that's really going to trigger you, and think about what you are going to do that won't involve drinking. I hope that's helpful. I find that a really interesting question, because when I wrote Alcohol Explained, I wrote it from the perspective of a binge drinker. As I say, there was only a couple of periods in my whole life where was daily drinking. And the maximum I think I did of that was about 3 months. My job always required me to use my brain. And when I was well rested and not drinking, I found my job really easy. And when I had been drinking and I hadn't slept properly, I found it almost impossible. So I almost had enforced upon me this not drinking during the week. And even when I was drinking increasingly heavily and even bringing in sick on Monday and then drinking again, I would eventually come out of these cycles, because I would have to get back to work and I would have to have had a couple of days sobriety under my belt to do my job. And I never actually got to the stage of losing a job, thankfully. So it's very interesting, and I hope that's useful, but that's what I would say. Start seeing alcohol for what it is and start thinking now, what am I going to do in 6 weeks' time when it really starts to get on top of me and I want to drink? What's going to be my pressure valve, my coping mechanism? The rest of the questions are fairly short, so I'll go. Probably I always say this, and then I start going off into one and talking about them. One of them, I've looked in every bookstore in Brisbane, Australia, and cannot find your book. Would love to read it. So I couldn't find a publisher for the book, so it's only available on Amazon. And I think if you want to read a hard copy in Australia, you need to order it. I don't think there's print on demand in Australia, so you have to order it from outside. So you can get it, but it takes weeks and weeks and weeks, unfortunately. You can download the Kindle version. You don't need a Kindle device to read a Kindle book. You can just download the free app. So that's the easiest way of doing it. If you're doing that anyway, Alcohol Explained 2 is reduced in UK and Australia for this month only. So it's worth doing it, just because then you can pick up a copy of Alcohol Explained 2 for, I think it's 99p in the UK and $1.49 or something in Australia. But yeah, unfortunately, I've never found a proper publisher, so it's not available in bookshops, only on Amazon. So someone else said, read the books and understand alcohol, what it does to us now. I find staying sober hardest though. Understand fading effect bias, which I've just talked about. My question, for long-term sobriety, do you think we need the support of a group, and is it important to do work on ourselves also? So that's really does depend on the individual. What I would say is, the ideal for me is to not have to be working on your sobriety. The ideal is you drank, you quit drinking, and now you get on with your life. Because if you have to spend hours a day working on your sobriety, yes, it's probably better than drinking, but that's not perfect, is it? What you want to do is get your life back and get on with your life. So that should be your ultimate goal. Some people are just confident enough to do that, others less so. Don't forget, there is fading effect bias and ambition. These are things that work in the long term. And you may be very happy being sober now. It may be perfect. You have no intention of ever drinking again. But in a year, 5 years, 10 years, the effects of fading effect bias and ambition kick in. And so you might need to do some work. What I would say is, if you're completely happy in your sobriety, then go and live your life and enjoy it. I personally am completely confident in my sobriety. I remain with the groups partly because it's become a bit of an obsession with me, partly because I just enjoy doing it, but also I think it is useful because, and even people posting when they're drinking, I think is really interesting, because when people post when they're drinking, they're not happy. And I think this is a big thing that a lot of people need to get their heads around. There's this big thing that, drinking is borrowing happiness from tomorrow, i.e., you're twice as happy tonight for being less happy the next day. But it isn't that, because drinkers aren't happy. You might get a bit of relief from the first couple of drinks, but that wears off, and then you need more drinks, and then you start to get intoxicated. And by its very nature, being sedated and intoxicated, you're not happy. You don't really know what's going on. And I think it's really interesting reading posts from people that have been drinking because they're not happy. And it may sound brutal, but even the constant day one posts are useful, because it reminds you of the reality of being a drinker. Because it's very easy to say, yes, I'm very happy to not drink, this is fantastic, and off you go. But then you're bombarded with all these images of laughing, happy drinkers, and people telling you it's nice to have a drink every so often, and blah, 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 blah. Staying close to the groups, I think, keeps you focused on the reality of it, and it stops the effects of fading effect bias and ambition from kicking in. So it's entirely up to you. And important to do work on ourselves. I do think you need to have those coping mechanisms in place. And what I would say is, if you're happy with your sobriety, just go and enjoy your life. But be careful and watch out for those first thoughts that will crop up, which will always be, what, a drink would be nice in X, Y, or Z situation. And that's the point you need to come back and start doing some work to remind yourself of the reality. But that's it. No, one of the things is, for me, as I say, was finding a method that could let you get on with your life without having to constantly be working on your recovery. It doesn't work like that for everyone. Some people do need constant work, but it very much depends on the individual. Do you think the tide could be turned on society's attitude towards alcohol like it was with smoking to an extent? Yeah, I absolutely think that's the case. Totally. I think it is going the way of alcohol. Funny enough, I was out today and I drove past where we used to live about 5 years ago or so. And I was there a couple of years after I stopped drinking, and then we moved into this house. And it was weird going past the pubs I used to drink in, and half of them are closed down now. People are just drinking less. Millennials tend to drink a lot less than the older generation. I think 100, 200 years ago, you could walk into a chemist and you could buy heroin and cocaine. You know, Sherlock Holmes, the character Sherlock Holmes, smoked and drank and took cocaine. He used to inject himself with cocaine. His views to drugs are changing, and they're changing over the last couple of 100 years. It used to be that inject yourself with this and it feels good, therefore it's good for you. We're getting away from that, and we realize that these things are poisons. Alcohol is almost the last bastion of acceptable drug addiction. 87% or something ridiculous of the population drink. It's a drug, and if you drink it regularly, it's because you're either chemically, physiologically, or psychologically addicted to it. And anyone who says otherwise is wrong. The fact of the matter is, it is turning round. It will end up like smoking is. I don't think we'll ever see the back of it entirely. But yeah, I definitely think it's on the out. And the other part of the question is, I think the day will come when drinking is banned on flights eventually. Well, funnily enough, that was the thing that was kicking off before lockdown, because there'd started to be loads of people getting drunk, or not. I think there always was, but it was coming more to the forefront about people getting drunk on flights. And I think the flights were getting annoyed with it because they're not reaping the benefits. Because if you're a publican, you open a pub, people get drunk, that's irritating, but they got drunk by spending lots of money in your boozer. So that's fine. So it's kind of like swings and roundabouts. But where the flights don't like it, because people turn up at the airport and do all the drinking at the airport and then get on the flight drunk. So they don't actually make any money from the people being drunk, but they have to deal with the fallout. So the actual flights themselves are very much against people drinking because they're not making any money from it and they're dealing with the fallout. So that's the way things were going. There was lots of stuff in the papers about, is there going to be bans on alcohol in airports and flights? And then, of course, lockdown came in, so the whole thing was brushed under the carpet. But I definitely see it going that way as and when we ever get back on flights again. I'm 51 days alcohol-free and doing well, following all your advice. However, for the last week, I've dreamt that I'm drinking alcohol every night. Last night in my dream, I was drinking Prosecco and was ready to give up on alcohol-free. Is this my subconscious working? Should I be worried? Thanks, you are what made me stop. So I wouldn't worry about it. I'm 7 years in February not drinking, and I stream quite regularly that I'm drinking in various different situations. Sometimes I'm kind of just had a load of drink and I'm just thinking, what on earth have I done? Other times I'm sort of walking around trying to find a pub that's open and I suddenly think, why am I doing this? I don't drink anymore. So I have all these kind of dreams and I just don't worry about it. Nobody knows what dreams are. People guess at things and will tell you this, that and the other with dreams, but nobody knows what dreams are. You can't control them, and I wouldn't worry about it. And I think for me, whenever I dream I'm drinking, I always wake up very relieved that I wasn't drinking. And for me, that's good enough. I remember Alan Carr, when he invented his stop smoking method, what is now 40 years ago, saying, I quite often dream I'm smoking and it's just a great relief to me when I wake up and realise that I didn't. And for me, it's as simple as that. Don't worry about it at all. And as long as you're still solid when you wake up, then it's great. I have a good uni friend who's given up on many occasions over the years and yet still drinks daily. I just invited him to this page after he announced that he's giving up smoking and drinking again at midnight. Despite me having recommended your book to him a year ago, I think he's going to attempt this without any help or additional knowledge. He just confided in me that more often than not, drink actually helps him. He believes it to be healthier than all the pharma drug pills other people pop to relax and maybe sleep. I'm anxious to help, but suppose until he's read the book, there's not much more I can do than keep nudging him in your direction. It is difficult, and I think it's a peculiarly male thing. I don't think all the time, but that's certainly my opinion of it, is that we don't like having help from people. And it is frustrating. And there's people in the group who have the book and have had the book for years and don't read it. And I think it's just that thing of, I can do this myself. I don't need help. And I don't know how to get around it because I do it myself really badly. So it is extremely difficult to know how to get around it. The point there is interesting, that alcohol actually helps him and he believes it to be healthier than all the pharma drug pills other people pop to relax and maybe sleep, which goes back to what I was saying before. quitting drinking is not just about how do I relax, it's about finding other ways of coping with life. Nobody needs a drink to relax, or pharmaceutical drug or pills. You don't need them. And I think that's the problem. If he's searching for that kind of stuff, it is difficult. But yeah, you're right. I don't think there's much you can do with people. You can try and explain some of the basic physiology to them, to see if it helps. But no, it is incredibly difficult. I mean, the first 5 chapters are on the website. I always put that there in the hopes that it would make it easier for people, because it's almost just like opening a web page to read it and to see if they're going to find it useful or not. But no, it is difficult, and I don't have an easy answer for that, I'm afraid. The next one is how to curb eating when alcohol free. Well, I don't think you want to curb eating entirely. Which brings me on to another thing. Diet and Fitness Explained is down to 99p as well in the UK and Australia. So if you're in the UK or Australia, you might want to pick up a copy of that. Eating is kind of similar to addiction in some ways, but not in others, because obviously it's not like alcohol where you just cut it out entirely. For me, eating is more about, and what Diet and Fitness Explained was about, is more about just analysing taste and feelings of fullness and feelings of hunger, to just look at what we eat and why we eat it and our eating habits. And obviously there is a big element to emotional eating as well. So that's a whole different topic. What you do need to bear in mind when you're drinking, alcohol has a massive impact on your weight. There's one obvious reason: it's got a load of empty calories in it. So I can't remember how many calories there are in a bottle of wine or a load of beer, but it's an awful lot. So there's that aspect. You're taking on a load of calories. The other thing that's quite interesting: alcohol is an energy source for humans, but one that can't be stored as fat. So when you're drinking a lot, it's a load of excess energy that your body can't do anything with. So it turns it into heat. So that's why when you drink a lot, you become very hot. Your body's turning all this excess energy into heat. But the problem is, because it's got too much energy, virtually anything you consume on top of it gets stored as fat, because your body's already got an excess of energy, so it doesn't need anything. So you could drink a load of wine and then eat a lettuce leaf, and it's going to be stored as fat because your body's got too much energy. So alcohol actually makes you much more inclined to store things as fat. The other issue, of course, is it's an appetite stimulant, which is very confusing because alcohol is a depressant. So how can it be a stimulant? How can it stimulate your appetite? Well, the fact of the matter is, appetite and digestion takes a huge amount of energy. When you eat something, your body literally, there's a dozen feet or something of digestive tract, and there's muscles that squeeze the food through every inch of that. It takes a huge amount of energy. So what your body tries to do is encourage you to eat when you're sitting down resting, because all the energy can be channeled to eating. So actually, it's when you sit and relax and when you take depressants and sedatives that you start to get hungry, because that's the time your body wants you to eat. So alcohol actually causes you to be falsely hungry because it's an additional sedative, and then when it wears off, it leaves behind an excess of something called dopamine. A lot of people think dopamine is something that makes you feel good. It doesn't make you feel good. It's a motivator. It makes you want to do things. Okay, it makes you feel like, I need to go and do something. And one of the things it makes you want to do a lot of is eat, which is why people wake up having drunk the night before and want to eat. So if you're not drinking, you might have dinner and then go to bed. If you are drinking, you might have dinner, you then consume another 1,000 calories in wine, you're then hungry. It's false hunger, but caused by the alcohol at the end of the evening. And then you wake up the following morning and you're hungry still because you've got all this dopamine making you want to overeat. There's yet another aspect, because alcohol prevents the absorption of certain nutrients like B vitamins and zinc. So your body doesn't just trigger hunger when you need calories, it triggers hunger when you're lacking in vitamins. So because you never have enough of these vitamins, because the alcohol won't let you absorb them, you're almost constantly hungry as a drinker. So for all of these reasons, drinking makes people hugely more likely to be overweight. So when you cut out drinking, you should lose weight. But remember, a very basic mechanism, if you're consuming more energy than you're burning off, you will gain weight. So if you cut out alcohol and you're still eating more calories than you're burning off, you won't lose weight. Okay, so that's a very simple mechanism. What I usually say to people is in the first week or two, don't worry about your eating, because you will have all this dopamine in you making you want to eat more. It's not a good time to try and curb your eating anyway. But after a few weeks, when things calm down a bit, then you can certainly look at it. Really, for me, stopping drinking provides the key to much easier weight loss. Okay, it doesn't guarantee you lose weight. And if you stop drinking and you're still eating loads, and you're not going to lose weight at all, you're going to gain weight. But it provides the key. It makes eating less more possible and easier. And you're taking on just less calories. And of course, the other thing is alcohol increases your heart rate. And lots of people realize that, which is why when you wake up at 4 a.m, your heart's going at 19 to the dozen, whatever it is. But what a lot of people don't realize is when your heart speeds up, you feel like you want to sit down. Your body tells you to sit down and rest when your heart rate goes up, which is why drinkers never have a lot of energy. They find exercise very difficult and hard work because their heart rate's already massively elevated. So not only does stopping drinking provide the key to getting on top of much healthier eating habits, it also provides the key to exercise. So I better get a move on, actually. Knocking an hour in a minute. This is the last question anyway. If drinking gets programmed into our subconscious after a while, why don't the bad after effects get programmed as well? I know in your book you say it's the timing, since the hangover happens the next day after drinking, so the subconscious doesn't have the ability to connect the two. So the subconscious is an incredibly amazing and clever part of the brain because it automates a lot of your decision making. Okay, but it's incredibly stupid in other ways, in that it only works on immediate cause and effect. So the example I give in the book is if you're a driver and you're then a passenger in a car, and the driver of that vehicle is driving too close to the vehicle in front or driving too fast, you find your right leg constantly tensing like you're trying to apply a brake. That's the subconscious that's just jumped in and learned from however many thousands of hours you spent in a vehicle as a driver that tensing your right leg will slow the vehicle down. So it's learnt it and learnt it and learnt it, and it jumps in and automates that. So whenever it requires something to happen, it will automate what it believes to be the motor reaction to cause the desired effect. Now, the problem with drinking is the ill effects come much later on, so the following day. But actually what happens is the brain does learn the whole process, but it actually works to our against us anyway. So when you first drink alcohol, let's say you've never drunk alcohol before, and as a teenager you have a few glasses of wine, you have a few too many, and you feel ill the next day. Okay, what your brain is telling you at that point is, you have had this substance, it's caused me to feel awful, I don't want you to have any more of it. So if you tried to drink wine the next day, you'd feel really sick. And we've all had that, where you drink too much and then you inadvertently smell something with alcohol in it and it makes you feel really sick. That's your brain saying, don't drink that again. It's caused you a massive problem and made you feel ill. Okay, that's our default state. If you taste something or eat something and it's bad for you, your brain says, don't have it again. But the problem is, because there's so much alcohol in society, and a wedding's a classic one. You turn up the day before, you have a few drinks, you wake up the next day a bit hungover, but the champagne's coming out. You don't really want any, but you sort of force it down. When you do that, your brain is learning a new lesson, because when you do get those few sips of champagne or beer or whatever inside you, that does a few things. It anesthetizes the anxiety caused by the previous drinks. If you're feeling sick, it will anesthetize those feelings of sickness. So when you drink through a hangover, you do actually start to feel a bit better. Now, your brain starts to learn that, and it reevaluates the whole situation on the basis of that information. And what it learns is, you drank too much and you felt awful, and I thought that I should stop you having alcohol, but actually alcohol really seems to help. And that's the main difference in my mind between the so-called normal drinker and the problem drinker, is when the more you drink and the more awful you feel from drinking, the more your brain is saying to you, oh, you really need a drink to get rid of that. And that's the big change. And that's the problem. This is learned. It's learned behavior, but it can never be unlearned. So, because it's true, the fact of the matter is, whether you're having your first drink or your millionth drink, when it wears off, it leaves an unpleasant feeling. And the quickest way to get rid of that unpleasant feeling is to take another drink. Okay, so you can learn that, but you can never unlearn it. And that's why, again, coming back to moderation is so inherently difficult, because when you learn that when one drink wears off, another one will take the edge off it, there's nothing you can do about that. And you're constantly fighting a losing battle. That's all the questions. I hope that was useful for everyone. I'll post again for the following week. And we'll do another one next week if there's enough interest in it. Happy New Year, everyone. As I say, let's see what 2021 brings for us. See you next week. Bye.